right, ladies and gentlemen, it is officially time for us to start reassembling the bottom end of this 6.2. If you've watched the previous videos, you saw we got this entire engine stripped down, cleaned, all the mating surfaces are nice and flat and smooth. We bored the cylinders, we polished the crank, we got the pistons, rockers, the whole nine. It's all clean, it's all good to go and ready to be reassembled. The heads are at the machine shop right now for just a couple days getting decked. We'll have those back here soon. So in the meantime, we're gonna start reassembling the block. Right now I have this entire block covered in WD-40. We're gonna get it unwrapped, we're gonna flip it over, and we're gonna start putting in our new bearings. We have cam bearings, crank bearings, rod bearings, the whole nine. We're gonna check all our clearances, make sure we're within spec of everything, and we'll get this thing reassembled. So let's just dive right in. So we're gonna start with our main bearings here. We have some king bearings that we're gonna put in. These are all just factory spec. Now for your main bearings, you'll see 4 of them have holes. This is for your oil passages. These go into the top of the block. And then you have just solid bearings, and these will go into the main caps. You'll notice every bearing has a little tang. You're just gonna wanna line them up with the marks on the block and on the main caps. Like I was saying, you want to really make sure that these are clean. No oils or anything on them when you put them in. All right, so I got the crank unwrapped. It was covered in WD-40 just so it wouldn't rust while it was here. I want to go ahead and clean all the journals real fast, and we'll get it thrown into the block. Now we're ready to throw it in the block, but I need to make sure none of the oil passages are facing up so I can plasti gauge this accurately without having any of the holes in the way. So we'll get this clocked how we want it and gently set it in. Now this is all totally dry, so you do not want to spin this while it's in this position. Double check, make sure all of our mains have no oil holes pointing up. We'll go ahead and get some plasti gauge thrown on here, and we'll get the main caps tossed on. Now if any of you have looked into building an LS, just like everything else, there's a million videos on how to do this. I'm not really going to go too in depth. We're just going to cut pieces of the plasti gauge to the same width of the journals. We'll get them thrown in, put the main caps on. We'll go through the whole torque sequence, and then we'll undo them, take them out, and we'll check all of our clearances with the new bearings to the crank. All right, so now we need to go through our torque sequence, torquing all of the inner bolts and outer bolts to 15 foot-pounds, and then doing the inner bolts to 80 degrees and the outer bolts to 51 degrees. All right, so we have our number 5. We want it to really just be between 0.002 and 0.0015. It looks like this bearing is perfect. I think that's 2 thousandths, so we're good there. All right, guys, so we checked all the clearances. They're all within factory spec. I believe that spec is anywhere from 0.0008 to 0.0025, so there's a pretty broad range in there. All of them are right around 0.002, which is fantastic. One of them is right between 001 and 0015, which is still within spec. It's a little more on the loose side, but it's all good, so we're gonna send it with that. Now, before we go ahead and lube all these up and install the crank for the final time, I need to put all of the cam bearings in while I have access and visibility down into the cam journals. So we're gonna go ahead and tilt this engine a bit more on its side, so all of the oil galleys for the cam journals are gonna be at 12 o'clock. Now, just like our mains, our cam bearings have holes in them also that you need to match up with the oil galleys here on the journals so you can get oil supplied to the cam. So that's the only major thing, is that you clock these appropriately. It doesn't matter which holes you line up, just make sure the holes line up with the galleys so you can get oil to the cam. Also, something to note, you have 3 different sizes of cam bearings on this engine. The middle one is its own size, 2 and 4 are their own size, and 1 and 5 are their own size also. They come in order in the box and the orientation that they need to be installed. They do all have part numbers on them that tell you where they need to go also. All right, let me show you what I'm talking about. Inside these cam journals here, you see all of the oiling holes where it feeds the cam. What I did is I clocked the engine so they are all at the 12 o'clock position. So now when I install the cam bearings, I can put the holes at the 12 o'clock position, center it inside this bore, and when I'm done, I'll get a little pick, shove it through the hole, and make sure that I am in fact lined up so oil can feed the cams. Same thing like with the main bearings, we will clean everything really well. The bearing, the journal, hit it all with compressed air right before we press it. And we'll use the same tool that we removed the bearings with. We'll start on the very back cam. We need to make sure that we spin it and clock the hole in the right position. And we'll give it a few good whacks so we get it right where it needs to be. Here you can see I have it centered. What I'm gonna do now is get a little pick, something like this. Since we cannot see if the hole in the bearing is lined up with the oil galley, we will grab a pick, put it up through the hole, and make sure it goes in, which it does. Fantastic. All right guys, all the cam bearings are installed. They look really good. All the holes in the bearings are lined up with the oil galleys in the block. Now we can go back to installing our crank for the final time. So I'm gonna go over all of these with brake clean one more time, hit them with the air compressor. I'm going to clean the crank one more time as well. We'll put a bunch of assembly lube on all the bearings and we'll get it in here. All right, we will start off doing all of the bolts at 15 foot-pounds. All right, so now we need to set the thrust bearing. We're gonna hit the front a couple times, hit the back a couple times. That'll just help center the crank on that thrust. You normally wanna use one of the harder, like plastic Delrin mallets. This is all I got, so I'm just gonna really give it some wax. All right, and now we're just gonna go through the rest of our torque sequence, doing the inner bolts to 80 degrees and the outer bolts to 51 degrees. All right, moment of truth. Let's go ahead and spin this crank and hopefully it spins free. Oh, beautiful. That feels buttery smooth. This right here is what you want. You want to be able to kind of flick your wrist and throw it. Fantastic, we love that. All right guys, the last thing we want to do is put the 10mm bolts in all of the sides of the main caps. GM calls for you to use some kind of sealant or silicone. I have some RTV I'm going to put right around the head just to stop any oil from leaking out the side of the block. And we'll torque those side bolts to 18 pounds. All right guys, so it's the next morning. We're back out here. We have the crank all done and assembled. Feels nice and good. All the bearings have good clearances. But now that we have these done, we need to go ahead and flip the motor over. We're going to start working on getting all of our piston rings. We're going to get the gap set on all of them, make sure it's within spec. And then we're going to start installing our pistons and checking the clearances on our rod bearings. So let's go ahead and just dive right into it. All right, so we have our Hastings piston rings from Michigan Motor Works, which is where everything that we ordered is from. And they are all labeled. We have our top ring, second ring, third ring, and our oiling rings also. So what we're gonna do is one piston at a time. I have made a list right here of cylinders 1 through 8. The top ring and the second ring are what we're mainly concerned with. That's what we're gonna be checking our gap on. So we'll take out a piston ring for cylinder 1. We'll get this wiped down, we'll get the bore wiped down, and I'm gonna use a spare piston as a depth indicator so we can get this set into the middle of the bore. It'll be nice and even. And then we'll check our gap, we'll write it down, and as we go, we'll get our gap set right. Once it's where we want it, we'll get it installed onto the piston. Now these specific piston rings do not have any kind of laser mark or hole, which means there's no top or bottom. You can install them whichever direction that you want. We'll use one of our pistons as a depth indicator. Now I'm going to go the whole depth of the piston, which puts the ring just about in the middle of the stroke. We'll start checking and seeing right where we are at. Now the second piston ring down, the middle ring, does have an indicator that says up, so we need to keep that in mind as we assemble the piston. All right, so that first ring we did came right out at 020, which is a little above like a modified street engine. I'm gonna keep these ring gaps on the higher side just in case we ever want to throw a small shot of nitrous at it. So I'm going to try and stay as close to 020 for all the top ones, which means we need to have the second ring, the middle ring, roughly 021 or 022, just a little bit bigger gap than the first ring. So this second one here is a lot smaller already. We are right at 018, so I need to gap this up closer to 021 and 022. So we're going to throw this on the piston ring filer and open up this gap a little bit. All right, so about 10 rotations on the ring filer got us to 020. The last thing I want to do is shoot over, so I'm going to give it another few turns and we'll see what it's at. All right, so we have the lower ones put on. Do our second ring, keeping mindful that this side needs to be up. And then our top ring, which does not have any indication on an up or down. Now all these rings need to be clocked in a certain position. Before we actually install the piston rings, I'll go over all that with you guys. And that's it. So now we're just gonna move on to number 2. I'm gonna throw you guys in a time lapse. This is probably gonna take a long time. We're just gonna go ahead and knock it out. Alright, that didn't take too long. I got all the piston rings done. Like I said, we will clock them properly when we go to install them for the final time. Until then, it really doesn't matter. They're going to move around a bit, so I don't want to waste my time trying to get them all perfect when I still need to put these into the block so I can get all my rod clearances. Alright guys, so we just finished up all of our piston rings. They're all gapped exactly where we want them. So the next thing that we need to do is check our rod bearing clearances. We're going to do 2 cylinders at a time using the plastic gauge, just like we did on the crank, to make sure everything's within spec. Alright, so starting on cylinders 1 and 2, I'm going to put the crank in its highest position so we can easily access the bolts for the main caps. Once I get the piston into the cylinder, I'm going to want to guide the bearing onto the crank. Alright, now we're going to torque these down to spec. These are 15 foot-pounds and then 85 degrees. Now that we got them torqued, just like the mains, we're going to loosen them up and check our clearances. Alright, here is our rod bearing number 1. Looks like it's exactly at 0.0015. Piston number 2, same thing, 0.0015. Alright guys, so we just finished up doing all of our rod bolt clearances. Now every single one of them across the board was 0.0015 as the clearance, which is a good bit tighter than we want them to be. If this was a street car and it wasn't going to be living at high RPMs all the time, I'd probably go ahead and just send it. But because this car is going to live on limiter, I want these clearances to be closer to like 0.0025-ish. So I'm going to go ahead and order those undersized bearings from Michigan. We'll get back with you guys when we get them. Alright guys, we're back, and just like that we have our new bearings. These are oversized bearings. Let me correct myself from the previous statement. I was a little mixed up on if I needed undersized or oversized. And the way to remember is just think about the crank. The clearances are too tight, then the crank is oversized. Therefore you need oversized bearings. But anyways, we got these. These are 1/1000th bigger. So these will take us from our 0.0015 to 0.0025, which would make it perfect clearance for what we want to do. So we're going to go through the whole process again. I'm going to flip the motor over. We're going to go 2 cylinders at a time, checking our clearances. I'll check back with you guys when we're done and show you the numbers. Alright, so this is the orientation for the pistons. It's really sloppy, but pretty much you have the front of the engine here indicated by this mark. And on the right hand side we want our top ring and our oil spacer. And on the left side we want our second ring, as well as the 2 oil rails facing that direction off at a 45 degrees. So on the right hand side, top ring right there in the middle. We need to find this oil expander where it is split. That right in the middle with the top ring also. Then on the other side we'll take the second ring, and off on 45-degree angles we want the bottom and lower rails for the spacer. Perfect. We will get a little bit of oil and our compressor on here, and then we'll throw it into the block. We're going to be installing the main caps for the final time. I just got them all lubed up, and we're going to be using some ARP hardware for the connecting rod. Alright, so I've been in a time lapse and I didn't realize that there's no sound. So as you can see, I'm installing all the rods now. Everything is right at 0.025, which is exactly where we want to be for our rod bearing clearance. I am using new ARP hardware for the connecting rod bolts. We're lubing everything up and just putting it all together as we go. I'm going to throw you guys back on the time lapse. We'll finish this out and I'll show you when I'm done. So now all the pistons are installed, the rods are assembled, all the ARP hardware is torqued to spec. Fantastic, that is what we want. We have our crank at top dead center, piston number 1 is at the top. Alright guys, so we have the majority of the block all done. The only thing that's really missing is our cam and lifters at this point. Once those get here, we'll go ahead and throw in the cam, the lifters, head gasket, and the heads. I just got the heads back from the machine shop. They're all decked and cleaned and good to go. But that's all we're going to have time for on this video. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Later.